Hello my friends, today we're going to be talking about a character design from the beta of Final Fantasy II. And as usual, I'm going to teach you some cultural facts during the discussion, specifically about the Maasai of Kenya. If you've never played Final Fantasy II before, let me try to quickly summarize it. Final Fantasy II is one of the darkest Final Fantasies. If you exist in the Final Fantasy II world, there is a 50% chance that you are gonna f***ing die. In the game's opening, you start off with 3 kids, Firion, Maria, and Guy. Their whole village is burnt to the ground and everyone in that village is dead. Anyway, you are pursued by a bunch of soldiers from the Palamecian Empire and they want to kill you. Fortunately, you get saved by Minwu and Queen Hilda and they recruit you into the rebellion, and then from there on you go and fight the Palamecian Empire and hope to bring down the Empire. So that's Final Fantasy II in a nutshell. So as I've said before, Final Fantasy II is not the best Final Fantasy. It's not even close. But I tend to find it very fascinating since unlike Final Fantasy I, which was mostly trying to be a Dungeons & Dragons style video game, Final Fantasy II was attempting to truly be its own thing and establish a solid identity for the Final Fantasy series. For example, many of the classic FF monsters were first seen in this game, including the Iron Giant, Malboro, Bomb, Adamantoise, and more. It even included the first appearance of the iconic Chocobo. On top of that, many character archetypes were first established here as well, such as Richard, who was the first Dragoon who laid the foundations for later Dragoons in the series like Kain in FF4. Then there's Layla, who is a female pirate captain who of course inspired Ferris from FF5, and the naive Guy, who was raised in the wild just like Gao from Final Fantasy VI, which frankly you wouldn't have known if you'd played the game because it doesn't even tell you about Guy's origin. Apparently there was some kind of novelization in Japan that told this backstory, which of course this is something that would need to be fleshed out if we ever got a proper remake of the damn game. And of course FF2, like other Final Fantasy games, has been remade and improved before. But they don't address some of the game's biggest issues, namely the shit-ass dungeons and their lame-ass trapdoors, which was a terrible game design choice. And to a lesser extent the battle system, which I don't mind as much as a lot of other people. Also, I want to see this fucking game in full 3D. It doesn't need to be as high quality as fucking a AAA game. It could be PS2 level 3D graphics, I don't give a shit. But it needs to be in full 3D with dramatic, full-voiced cutscenes that actually flesh out the characters and the story more. Alright? We don't need the only line for a Guy to be, "I speak beaver." Wow, great fucking character development. And we don't need Maria to just be girl. Give us more fucking character development. Alright, so you get my point. There's a lot of fucking shit that could be improved in Final Fantasy II, but instead they're spending their time remaking Final Fantasy VII, which, hey, that remake looks really damn good, but Final Fantasy VII was already a good game. Final Fantasy II, on the other hand, really fucking needs a remake. Anyway, getting back to what I was saying previously, there are many other characters besides the ones I just mentioned who also lay the foundations for future Final Fantasy characters, including one of my favorite characters, Minwu. See, Minwu in the game goes on a quest to find the ultimate magic spell, which is literally called Ultima. And you can see his quest being echoed in Tella's quest in Final Fantasy IV, where he goes and tries to find the ultimate spell of that game, which is called Meteo. And besides that link, you can also find another link to Minwu in Final Fantasy V, where his costume design was the inspiration for the male outfit for the Sorcerer job class. Minwu, as I pointed out in a previous video, was the first dark-skinned character in a Final Fantasy game. Whether you choose to interpret him as being inspired from the Middle East or Africa, either way, he clearly has dark skin. And last time I talked about how his sprite was whitewashed. Today, however, I'm talking about a character who was completely changed. He was whitewashed at the concept art stage of development. I'm talking about a character named Paul, who was a thief who helped the good guys in their revolt against the Palamecian Empire. The character on the left side of the screen is the final design for Paul. and it shows a blonde white dude, or I suppose you could interpret him as a Japanese dude since many anime characters have blonde hair. But either way, he is a character who is lighter in skin tone than the version on the right. And that version on the right is the older concept art of Paul. And that older concept art looks like a black dude. In fact, when I first saw this artwork, I immediately thought of the Maasai of Kenya and Tanzania. So I compared this old design with some images of the Maasai and also of other East African peoples. And to be fair, I didn't find an exact match, but I do think that this does kinda look similar, just like how Leon's armor is not an exact match to any European armor, but it certainly does evoke European knighthood. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that this original version of Paul was intended to evoke an African warrior. So, why was this character changed so drastically? Well, we'll likely never know for sure, but I can speculate some reasons. Obviously, racism could have been a factor here, and in my script I have written quite a bit about just the history of racism in the gaming industry in general, not just Square, but other companies as well. But I think we should probably talk about that another day, because I think if I include this whole discussion, it might make this video a little too long. So, we can always talk about that some other time. But yes, just keep in mind, racism could have definitely played a factor in why this concept art was completely removed. Anyway, having said all that, I do think there are other factors that could be at play here. For example, given that the two designs are extremely different, it's possible that Paul was originally not supposed to be a thief, because the old design has a spear, indicating he's a warrior. I don't know about you guys, but I've never seen a thief using a spear. Bilbo Baggins in Lord of the Rings never picked up a spear. It's just not a thief weapon, you know what I mean? Spears are a weapon of war, and also hunting. So, the change may also be for story reasons, but if that's the case, why not just change costumes and weapons? Why did they also have to change his race? I suppose you could argue that it might not be a good idea to depict a black character as a thief, but Paul is a Bilbo/Robin Hood style of thief, in that he's a good guy fighting against evil tyranny, so I don't think that argument would hold much weight. Plus, had they not whitewashed Minwu, players would have had 2 men of color in the game, which would probably be some kind of world record in the 1980s video game sphere. Speaking of Minwu, considering the fact that he's from Mysidia, it's sort of become my headcanon that the black mages of Mysidia are black mages. I should also point out that the 20th anniversary remake added a new secret boss character called Demuin, who kinda looks similar to Minwu. Not only does he have dark skin, but he also has a similar costume. So seeing as the old FF games get remade from time to time, how would I like to see this Paul issue be addressed in a future remake? Well, as I previously stated, this older design for Paul doesn't look like a thief. So instead of replacing the current Paul, I think it would be cooler if this older design was used for a new character, with a new name and purpose. If they can add someone like Deumian out of nowhere, then why not add a character that actually had some old concept art? So before I begin, I just want to reiterate to you all that what I'm about to say is my own idea on how we can re-establish this old concept character that was abandoned and put him back into FF2. We're gonna give this guy a new name, a Maasai name, Saiji, and his role in the game will take inspiration from the Maasai as well. He can be based on both a Maasai warrior and Laban. A Laban is a mystic leader of the Maasai and a few other East African cultures. The Laban sanctioned the raids of the warriors and also provided them with magical protection. Additionally, they were involved in coming-of-age ceremonies. species. Also, they were rainmakers, and they are intermediaries between human beings and the world of the dead. In colonial times, Kenya was taken over by the British Empire. When Britain colonized Kenya, they wanted to control the Liban, so they forced the Maasai Liban to live on the Lotai Plateau, and they weren't allowed to leave without Britain's permission. In FF2, the world is being taken over by the Palamecian Empire. Unlike some other FF villains, Emperor Matthias is not trying to just kill everyone. He certainly kills a hell of a lot of people, but like the British Empire, he's a calculating foe. So, I think the way to reintroduce this Maasai-inspired character into the world of FF2 is to have the Palamecian Empire confine Saiji and his people to this peninsula over here on the map. And that peninsula is close by Matthias' castle. That way his troops can better watch over Seiji's people and their activities. Saiji and his people would be capable of water magic, just like their real-life counterparts. This would be strategically useful for Matthias to control, since his domain is within a desert. In other words, these rainmakers could fertilize the crops that would feed Matthias' troops. Now, FF2 did not have water magic. I think water magic first appeared in FF5 as a blue magic spell, and only really became a big thing in FF10. But you see, I'm envisioning a remake that is vastly overhauled with better dungeon designs and a better battle system, more akin to Final Fantasy X. I would want some of Final Fantasy II's ideas to still carry over, but I'd want it to be merged with that far more satisfying battle system of FF10. So, how and why would your party meet up with Saiji? Well, in the original FF2, the Emperor at one point locks you in an arena with a behemoth. It's the first time the iconic monster appears in the FF series. My idea would build this battle up even more. Before storming the castle, your team would receive intelligence from one of the members of the Wild Rose Rebellion, possibly from Queen Hilda herself. She would explain to the team that the Emperor is guarded by a massive beast known as the Behemoth that has killed every warrior that has stood before it. Only one man has ever successfully slain a behemoth, a mystic known as Saiji. Rumor has it that he's being held against his will on a peninsula near the Palamecian Desert. This would be another allusion to Maasai culture. Traditionally, Maasai warriors learned to kill a lion as a rite of passage in the past. This tradition is illegal nowadays, and before you get mad at this African tradition, I just want you to realize that the main reason why African animals have become endangered is not due to African traditions. It's more so because of foreign businesses who want stuff like elephant tusks and rhino horns. That's the main driving factor in these species being endangered. Anyway, getting back on topic, Firion and friends make their way to the peninsula where Saiji is said to be. But when they get there, the settlement is in ruins, and no one there is alive. It appears as though Saiji's people must have rebelled against the Empire, and Matthias likely crushed the rebellion with his devastating magic. At least that's what it seems. The team finds some water magic tomes in the rubble, but otherwise they must move on without the help of Saiji. They make their way through the desert and finally get to the front gate of the Colosseum, which is at the base of the mountain where Matthias' castle is. There, at the entrance, they see someone battling against the Palamecian troops. It's Saiji, and he's come to avenge his people. And so Firion and his team join Saiji in his fight. So it's kinda like when the kingdom of Doma was poisoned in Final Fantasy VI, and Cyan goes on an almost suicidal revenge quest. So yeah, Saiji would have some similarities to Cyan. Like I said earlier, characters from past FF games often get echoed in later games. Now some of you will remember that at this point you already have a 4-man team, but remember I said the game should be more like FF10. So, in this instance, you can have more characters on your team, where some people will be in reserve, and you can bring some team members into the fray on the fly. And due to this change, characters like Gordon and Layla would be permanent team members because they might as well be. And we can probably make Saiji a permanent member too, because even though this is Final Fantasy II, technically not every character has to die. So, finally, the team makes their way into the Colosseum, and then Mateus unleashes the Behemoth. Already now you get to see what Saiji can do. In FF1 and 2, characters didn't really have unique abilities, but this is a remake, and so Saiji will have an ability called Leap. It allows him to leap over an opponent and cause a pincer attack formation. Pincer attacks were a random lucky battle condition in FF6 and FF7, and I think there was at least one time in FF7 where it was scripted. A pincer attack allowed you to surround an opponent, meaning that while the enemy was looking at one part of your team, your other buddy or buddies could do back attacks for more damage. So other than the obvious, why would this specifically be good against the Behemoth? Well, I was thinking that in this remake, the Behemoth of FF2 would act more like the Behemoth of FF4. In FF4, the Behemoth would counterattack every physical attack that you would do against it. So, I imagine that when you do the Leap ability and get behind the Behemoth, none of your attacks get counterattacked because the Behemoth's attention is on the other side of the battle arena. So that would give you a great advantage in this fight. I hope you like the idea of the Leap ability. It too is inspired by the Maasai, who are known for their high jumping abilities in real life. They not only do jumping competitions, but also they have a jumping dance. In fact, I got the name Saiji from a known historical high jumper named Saiji Oge. The reason I called the technique Leap instead of Jump is due to Final Fantasy already having a different ability called Jump, which is used for Dragoons. And that allows the Dragoons to jump into the air to avoid the enemy and then dive attack the foe. This classic FF ability would of course be given to Richard the Dragoon, as any FF fan would expect. And of course I would give every FF2 character an ability, maybe multiple abilities. Let's just real quick, for funsies, distribute abilities to all these old characters. Firion would have the Geomancer abilities. Why? Because Geomancy is a fucking awesome ability that barely ever gets used in the FF series. We would explain this by simply saying Firion practiced this under a master before his home was totally burnt to the ground. But because FF2's driving philosophy is all about becoming strong with practice, and there's no chosen one, that means that just like magic, your Geomancer skills will suck at first, and will become much better when you practice with it, and it will become much more powerful as time goes on, until at the end of the game you'll be able to summon a motherfucking tornado just like Emperor Mateus can. Maria will have the dance ability, which causes random stat effects. Guy will have catch, which will let him catch monsters and then release it against another monster. Layla will have the plunder ability. I don't think that you ever actually have an ability in the FF series called plunder, but basically I'm talking about mug, which will let her mug an enemy and get some loot. By the way, if you don't know, the other Paul didn't join the team in the original, so even though he's a thief, he's not on the team, so Layla gets to be the one who steals stuff. Anyway, Gordon would have Mix, which is a chemist ability, and that lets you combine items for neat effects. Joseph could have the standard monk stuff, probably chakra, and Leon would have Darkwave. And I mean Darkwave, not darkness, not that shit from the 3DS. I want the OG Darkwave. It attacks all enemies at the cost of some of your life. Scott can have Guild Toss, why not? Anyway, lastly, since Minwu was the inspiration for the Sorcerer job class in FF5, we can give him Spellblade, which lets him enchant everyone's weapons with fire, ice, lightning, and more. Sometime after Firion and Saiji and the rest of the team vanquish the Behemoth, when they have some downtime, Maria says that her grandma used to tell her all sorts of stories about adventures that she had gone on, and one of those stories was about Saiji's culture, and she remembers hearing that his people could communicate with the dead. This, of course, is another connection to the real-world Liban of the Maasai, and I should note that many African religions involve communication with the ancestral plane, so that's not some kind of thing that's exclusive only to the Maasai. Anyway, Maria asks Saiji, "Is it true that you can communicate with the dead?" And Saiji says, "Yes, of course." So then she asks Saiji, "Can you contact my grandmother for me?" And Saiji replies, "Oh, sure, just a moment." So a bit of time passes and Saiji says, "You know, I just realized that this place we're in has bad vibes, and that's not good for communicating with the dead. Let's try some other time." So in other words, Saiji, this legendary warrior, is too proud to admit that he's no good at the whole communicating with the dead thing. So that would add some neat additional depth to his character. And like every skill in FF2, this would be something that he eventually gets better at as the game progresses. And when he finally does contact the dead, he'll learn from one of his dead comrades that in the fog of battle, although many of his people did indeed die, a small few were able to survive. Near the end of the game, he will be able to reunite with those survivors. And the reason I think at least some portion of his people should survive is just because I don't want Saiji's story to feel too much like Richard's story, because literally every Dragoon dies in FF2, so we gotta have some variety. Lastly, spoilers for a really old game, when you kill Mateus, his soul splits in two. One half goes to hell, and the other half, oddly enough, goes to heaven. And from there, it's implied that Mateus killed both God and the devil and assumed both of their roles as Emperor of Heaven and Emperor of Hell. The Emperor of Heaven was actually a retcon for one of the remakes, and I think it's an interesting retcon, so I think it should stay in. Anyway, in the final battle, Firion and friends destroy the Emperor of Hell, while your dead comrades vanquish the Emperor of Heaven. This happens at the exact same time, seemingly by coincidence. I would add to this moment by having Saiji communicate with your dead allies, so the simultaneous attack on both emperors is not a coincidence, but a strategic plan, which your living and deceased team members coordinate together. Alrighty, I guess that's all, folks. There was 3 things I wanted to do today. 1, enlighten you all about a black character from Final Fantasy's concept art that we never got. 2, teach you a little bit about the Maasai and how this African culture could be integrated into an old school RPG. And 3, give me an excuse to ramble about ideas for improving Final Fantasy II, which frankly I could have said more, but I'm sure this video's long enough already. Thanks for watching, everyone.